Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2024 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of Leninism or Trotskyism by Lev Kamenev from 1924. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or buy me a coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. So this is our first audiobook from Kamenev, and basically it is an enlarged version of a speech which was given within days of the much better known Trotskyism or Leninism by Stalin. And I said it's from 1924, the speech was from November 1924. This reworked written version was actually published in 1925. I mentioned that Stalin has a similar and much better known piece by almost the same title. That's because at this time, for several years, Kamenev was involved with Stalin and Zinoviev against Trotsky. However, Kamenev was kind of a wavering figure. He was a Bolshevik for a long time, but in late 1917, just as the Bolshevik uprising was set to go, he briefly went Menshevik as he was afraid that the revolution wasn't going to work out. Nevertheless, after the revolution, he went back to the Bolsheviks and was part of the Soviet government. But then in 1926, after having been part of the anti-Trotsky bloc, he crossed over and joined Trotsky. For this, he was expelled from the party, but he was later readmitted. Then he was expelled again in 1932, was let back in again, then was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and then in 1936, during the Moscow trials, he was tried for treason and was executed. So a lot of ups and downs for Kamenev. But I thought it would be interesting to do this piece as we're going to do Trotskyism or Leninism right after this, and if you have both, then you can compare them. So let's begin. It starts out with a note from Kamenev. It says, "The following is a written version of the speech given by me on the 18th November at the session held by the Moscow Committee, enlarged by the active party functionaries, and repeated on 19th November at the session of the Communist fraction of the Trade Union Council, and on 21st November at the Conference of Military Functionaries. Comrades, the subject of my speech will be Comrade Trotsky's latest publication, the article which appeared on the eve of the 7th anniversary of the October Revolution and entitled by its author, The Lessons of October. Trotsky presents the party with books fairly frequently. Hitherto we have not thought it necessary to pay much attention to these books, although it is not difficult to find in many of them various deviations from Bolshevism, from the official ideology of our party. But this book must be accorded special attention and subjected to a thorough analysis, the more that Comrade Trotsky has selected the theme of the Lessons of October for his last publication. As our whole party, the whole Communist International, the whole international labor movement, and the whole working youth are learning the lessons taught by the October Revolution and will continue to learn theirs, it is not possible to consider the interpretation of these lessons as the private affair of this or that writer. As the Lessons of October appears with the countenance of the party, and as it has been written by a member of the CC and the political bureau of our party, which, and this is no secret, is the leading party in the Comintern, then it is perfectly clear that we are threatened by the danger of having such proclamations, such, quote, lessons, accepted as textbook by not only our youthful members, but also by the whole Comintern. And the form assumed by Comrade Trotsky's work shows it to aim at being a textbook for the Comintern. All who have read the article are bound to see that it appeals not only to our party, but to the international proletariat as well, and to the communist parties of all countries, and thus it is not a matter of private opinion, but a political conflict concerning the whole party. Should any comrades maintain that the conflict aroused by Comrade Trotsky's book is merely a conflict between Trotsky, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Stalin, and Kamenev, a difference of opinion between literates, these comrades would prove that they are unable to grasp the real interests of the party. Comrades holding such an opinion can only do so because they would like to utilize the party conflicts for the purpose of forming some third group, based on the slogan, "The literates are quarreling among themselves, but it has nothing to do with us." No one has a right to stand aside in this conflict. It concerns one of the most far-reaching questions of our inner life and of the life of the Comintern. The question is, can the party recommend the proletariat to accept the lessons as taught by Comrade Trotsky's book, or should the party exercise the whole of its authority in warning the proletariat against the teaching of the, quote, Lessons of October? I'm not desirous of here entering into a long controversy with this article of Comrade Trotsky's. Comrade Trotsky is an excellent writer, and his gifted pen has done for the party much valuable service, but here it serves interests hostile to the party. Here it does not serve Bolshevism, but the cause of those seeking to disintegrate and discredit Bolshevism. Both the Bolshevism embodying the ideology of the proletarian revolution and the Bolshevism organizing the fighting force of the proletariat. And Comrade Trotsky does this by means of an exceedingly artistic, but essentially incorrect and inaccurate description of the whole of the events between February and October. I have no doubt but that the party will call upon a number of its writers, among those who participated in the events of this period and took immediate part in the struggle leading up to the October Revolution, and that these will refute the various misrepresentations made by Comrade Trotsky with reference to decisive moments in the history of our party during this epoch. The April demonstration is misrepresented, the April conference is misrepresented, the events in June and July are misrepresented, the events in connection with the preliminary parliament are misrepresented, and finally the course taken by events in October itself are misrepresented. Here I cannot dwell upon the details required for the restoration of historical truth, or on the confronting of Comrade Trotsky's assertions by documentary evidence. What I want to deal with here is the general question of the social and political import of the attitude adopted by Comrade Trotsky, and the significance of this attitude when considered in the light of the previous positions taken up by Comrade Trotsky, and of the role played by Comrade Trotsky. We have hitherto abstained from posing this question for easily comprehensible reasons, but now we can avoid it no longer, for Comrade Trotsky, in thus raising the question of October, the question of the role played by our party, and by Lenin in the creation of the ideology underlying the October Revolution, himself forces us to deal with the question from all the standpoints which have been adopted by Comrade Trotsky during the history of the Bolshevist Party. I am thus obliged to deal with the concrete question of Trotskyism and Bolshevism, and in doing this I refer to Comrade Trotsky's latest utterance merely as one of the clearest and most instructive examples of the general line pursued by Comrade Trotsky. We must first of all ask ourselves, does any general line really exist? What do we understand under the term Trotskyism? Is it a question of Comrade Trotsky's personality, or of general, and by no means personal phenomena, pertaining to the history of the labor movement in Russia during the last 20 years? What have we to deal with here? With a personality? With an individuality? Or with some generalization, some trend called into being by the general conditions of the evolution of the labor movement in a petty bourgeois country? With an accidental phenomenon? Or with a phenomenon based upon a past which we cannot forget? If you turn to Comrade Lenin's works for a reply to this question, you will find that up to the time of the February Revolution, and again with a brief interruption after the year 1918, scarcely a work appeared from Comrade Lenin's pen in which Trotskyism was not dealt with systematically. Why? Section 1. Trotsky and the Party before the Revolution of 1917. Our party originated in a petty bourgeois, capitalistically backward country. Our proletariat existed under more backward conditions than any other proletariat in Europe. It was surrounded by more agrarian and petty bourgeois elements than any other proletariat. And the question of how this proletariat succeeded in the midst of czarist despotism in creating and welding together a party destined to lead the whole international labor movement, this is the main question of the self-knowledge essential to the party. This question of our origin and development has frequently been raised in the party itself, and the party has made it clear to itself why and in what manner the proletariat of Russia, to use the old word, in a backward agrarian country and under the despotism of the Tsar, has been enabled to create that Leninism which is today the guiding star of the whole international proletariat, of the proletariat of countries much further developed in capitalism and much further advanced in economics than Russia. One thing is certain. Under these conditions, the party of the revolutionary proletariat, the party of the Bolsheviki, could only originate in the form of constant, systematic, and unceasing struggle against the petty bourgeois element striving to subordinate the working class. Bolshevism, in its innermost essence, signifies a struggle, in the sense that it originated, grew, and attained its firm foothold in the midst of an uninterrupted and constant struggle against every influence exercised by the bourgeoisie on the proletariat. The most concentrated expression of the policy of bourgeois influence on the proletariat is afforded by Menshevism. The 30 years of the history of Bolshevism is the history of 30 years of struggle against Menshevism. Leninism is the teaching of the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. Precisely for this reason, Leninism is, therefore, at the same time the teaching of the struggle against Menshevism. The forms in which the bourgeoisie has exercised its influence over the proletariat have changed with the changes of the historical epoch, and the forms and methods of Menshevism have changed accordingly. What has remained unchanged is the wild Leninist struggle against Menshevism, Lenin's ability to distinguish the true character of Menshevism in every changing form, and to recognize the essential hostility of Menshevism against the Bolshevist ideology and the development of the Bolshevist party. Everyone knows this, or at least it may be assumed that everyone ought to know it. Everyone comprehends that those who are not fully conscious that Bolshevism signifies a systematic struggle against Menshevism understand nothing whatever of Bolshevism, nothing of the reasons why Bolshevism has been victorious. But everyone does not know, though it has been assumed till recently that everyone was bound to know it, that precisely as Leninism originated, grew, and conquered in a constant and systematic struggle against Menshevism, it originated, grew, and conquered in a constant and systematic struggle against Trotskyism. Why? Because Trotskyism, during the whole of the period in which our party was preparing for the decisive class struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, and in which Leninism was the source of the teaching of the proletarian revolution and welded the party together as leader of the revolution, during the whole of this time, Trotskyism played no other role than that of an agent of Menshevism, a glossing over of Menshevism, a masking of Menshevism. Everyone who studies the history of the party, in the works of the party, in the works of Lenin, and we have not, nor shall we ever have, a better and profounder textbook on the history of the party and the revolution, or one richer in matter and the conclusions to be drawn from it, will be inevitably convinced that during the whole of his struggle for the party and for the revolution, and during the whole of his struggle against the Mensheviki, Lenin regarded Trotsky, taking the line followed by him for decades in its totality and his separate actions, exclusively as an agent of Menshevism, as a servant of Menshevism, as a tool employed by Menshevism for the purpose of gaining influence in this or that section of the working class. To Lenin, Trotsky and Trotskyism were characteristic and not accidental phenomena, caused by the pressure exercised by the bourgeoisie in precisely the same manner as the other phenomena hostile to the really proletarian party, and many other groups and subgroups, fractions and subfractions, whole and semi-tendencies, which the working class have had to combat when creating their own party. To Lenin, Trotsky was entirely uninteresting as a personality after the year 1903. For Lenin and for the party, he has been the typical embodiment of one of these historical currents which have run counter to the creation of the Bolshevist party and to the development of Bolshevist ideology, the ideology of proletarian revolution and Bolshevist proletarian organization. To Lenin, Trotsky was the worldly embodiment of an element hostile to the proletariat, an element showing talent at times, again simply the embodiment of certain social phenomena. This systematic struggle against Trotskyism as an anti-Bolshevist current is to be found in every volume of Lenin's works up to the time when Trotsky joined our party. At this point, there is an interruption, followed by the resumption of this struggle in another form. The period of the First Revolution, 1905. Up to the time of the Second Party Congress, up to the split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, Comrade Trotsky worked for the Leninist Iskra, the Spark, like Martov, Patrusov, and other Mensheviks. Comrade Trotsky's zeal for the execution of Lenin's plans even led to his receiving the nickname of Lenin's Cudgel at the first meetings of the Party Congress, an honorable role. But for Comrade Trotsky's political history, this role is less characteristic than the fact that he immediately changed roles as soon as the Mensheviks appeared on the scene at the later sessions of the same Congress. The organizational rupture between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks took place at the Party Congress on the question of the election of the Central Committee of the party. 3 members had to be elected to the CC. With respect to 2 members, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks were in agreement. As the 3rd member, the Mensheviks wanted the Lenin's cudgel of yesterday, but Lenin would not agree at any price. The Mensheviks would not give way at any price. It is probable that Lenin and Martov had both formed a correct estimate of the degree in which the cudgel actually was Lenin's. Lenin had the majority at the Congress, and Trotsky was not elected. Upon this, Comrade Trotsky, in collaboration with Martov, Don, Axelrod, and others, formed the fraction of the Mensheviks, broke the decisions of the Party Congress, headed the boycott against the central authorities of the party under Lenin's leadership, and wrote a political pamphlet against Lenin, one of the most arrogant and offensive productions in Menshevist literature, in which Lenin's whole policy is explained as mere greed of power on the part of a, quote, candidate for the post of dictator. The whole set of Mensheviks, headed by Martov, Don, and others, recommend the press to propagate this pamphlet as far as possible. This was the beginning of the history of Menshevism, and of the history of Comrade Trotsky in the party. Trotsky, now a sword-bearer to Martov and Axelrod, lost all interest as a political figure in the eyes of Lenin. Lenin entered into lengthy and systematic conflicts with the Mensheviks, with Plekhanov, Martov, Axelrod, Martinov. He explained and revealed their standpoint to the workers, but he held it to be superfluous to lose time in contentions with their co-worker Trotsky. Quote, Plekhanov must be combated, Martov's arguments must be refuted, and we can contend against the extreme opportunist Martinov, but it is not worthwhile to lose time in contending against Trotsky, unquote. So said Lenin at that time to his fellow workers. But when, in the summer of 1905, Comrade Trotsky tried to draw himself out of the Menshevist bog by presenting the ideas of Parvis on permanent revolution in his own wording, then Lenin entered into a detailed discussion on the ideas and slogans brought out by Parvis and rejected them. With reference to Trotsky's pamphlet, he merely expressed his regret that the, quote, revolutionary social democrat Parvis should deem it possible to concur, quote, with Trotsky and his, quote, revolutionary phrases. Lenin had not another word to say about Comrade Trotsky and his, quote, original theory. And now Comrade Trotsky is endeavoring to lay precisely this pamphlet before the party as certificate of his revolutionary past, and is trying to prove that Lenin was only right insofar as he shared the standpoint of Trotsky's pamphlet. We shall deal with this in detail later on. During the whole period of the First Revolution, when the working masses had for the first time the opportunity of testing in action the various theories of the Russian Revolution and the resultant tactical methods, and when Lenin defended the Bolshevist scheme of revolution in desperate battle, he did not think it once necessary to add anything to his characterization of Trotsky's principles or to the designation of revolutionary phrases. Lenin knew that Trotsky's left phrases on the permanent revolution would certainly have no effect upon the actual course taken by the labor movement revolution, and would not in the least prevent Comrade Trotsky from remaining in the Menshevist organization, cooperating in the Menshevist central organ, and collaborating politically with the Mensheviks. Lenin had the Marxist habit of judging people, parties, and fractions according to their deeds and not according to their words. During the whole epoch of the First Revolution, 1905 to 1907, which gave the proletariat its first opportunity of appearing in the arena as a mass force, and of expressing its class policy and relations to other classes by actual action, there was a bitter struggle between two tactics only, between two political trends only, between two schemes of Russian revolution only, between Menshevism, which underestimated or neglected the peasantry and aimed at an understanding between the working class and the bourgeoisie, comment which is fundamentally opportunist, continuing, and Bolshevism, which called upon the peasantry to support the working class, both in its struggle against Tsarism and in its struggle against the bourgeoisie on behalf of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. This struggle between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks during the First Revolution, essentially a struggle for the direction to be assumed by the revolution, as also the whole of the First Revolution itself, contained all the elements of the struggle ended in the Second Revolution in 1917. The Parvis-Trotsky theory played no part whatever in either the First or the Second Revolution. It remained the empty phrase foreseen by Lenin and had nothing to do with the actual course taken by the class struggle. It has not been preserved in the living events of the actual struggle, but solely in the dusty files of old Menshevist newspapers. Therefore, Lenin never lost a word during the revolution in the refutation of this theory. The period of counter-revolution. The tide of revolution ebbed. The party reorganized for difficult and tedious work in the atmosphere of counter-revolution. The left phrases entirely lost effect. The foundations for new tactics had to be laid, and every effort had to be made to save all that was to be saved, the banner of the revolutionary tactics of the proletariat and the principles of their illegal organizations, from the counter-revolutionary pogroms, the destruction of proletarian organizations, the orgies of apostasy, the atmosphere of exhaustion in the working class, and the treachery and malicious joy at the failure of the revolution. The banner of the revolutionary policy of the working class, derided and trodden in the dust by all the Mensheviks, had to be defended. At this moment, the most difficult of all for the Bolshevist party, since the whole atmosphere engendered by the crushing of the revolution took effect against the Bolsheviks, and aid was given on all sides to Menshevist and liquidatory tendencies, liquidatory both with regard to the party and the revolution. At this moment, Comrade Trotsky, who at the time of the rising revolution combined with Parvis in wanting, quote, to be absolutely more revolutionary than the others, should obviously have rushed to the help of the Bolsheviks. At least this was the course taken by Plekhanov, who had been our opponent in principle from 1905 to 1907. The old revolutionist could not bear to stand aside, and in the face of general apostasy, he rushed into the fight side by side with the Bolsheviks under the slogan of general differentiation, that is, a general separation of proletarian revolutionists from the Menshevik liquidators. Trotsky acted differently. During this period of the beginning of the counter-revolution, Comrade Trotsky stepped forward for the first time at the London Party Congress. At this Congress, the Bolsheviks were fighting against the Menshevist liquidators, especially against the fraction of the Second Duma, headed by men now well known to us, Don and Tseretelli. The Bolsheviks criticized this Duma fraction as a fraction which, representing the Menshevist standpoint, was attempting to tread the path of West European social democratic parliamentarism. We are only too well aware that this is a hothouse in which the most poisonous fruits of treachery against the working class find the most fertile soil. The Bolsheviks criticized severely the very first step being taken in this direction. Comrade Trotsky, of course, defended the Menshevist fraction against the attacks of the Bolsheviks. Lenin characterized his standpoint as follows, quote, Trotsky spoke on behalf of the center. He expressed the views of the Federation. The Federation is the most opportunist and unprincipled organization which has ever existed in the party. Lack of principle is even more characteristic of it than opportunism. It was the organization of the artisans, and it reflected their unproletarian spirit. He attacked us for submitting the draft of an unacceptable resolution. He threatened with an actual split. Trotskyists threatening a split? Is this not monstrous? The fact that it is possible for a question to be put in such a manner shows in itself that our party contains something foreign to it. This is not a standpoint based on principles, it is the lack of principle, characteristic of the so-called center, and at the same time, naturally, of its defender, Trotsky, unquote. Comrade Lenin found equally trenchant terms in which to characterize Comrade Trotsky's standpoint at the time when our party summed up its experiences won in 1905, and established on this basis the foundation for the whole future of the party. The words uttered by Lenin at this time reached into the future, and foresaw the role which Comrade Trotsky was destined to play in our party during the next decade. This was Comrade Trotsky's first deed after the Revolution of 1905. From this time onwards until the year 1917, Comrade Trotsky acted unceasingly as defender of the Mensheviks against the Bolsheviks, as adversary of the Bolshevist party, steeling itself in the struggle of that time, and he was invariably regarded by the party as an adversary. Let us follow Lenin still further, and see how he characterized the role played by Comrade Trotsky during the difficult process of creating a Bolshevist party, that is, during the process of creating the theory and organization for the leadership of the proletarian revolution. May 1910. This is the date of the formal separation of the Bolsheviks, the first mental and organizational withdrawal of the Bolsheviks from the supporters of bourgeois influence upon the proletariat, from the Menshevist liquidators headed by Martov and Axelrod, and from the Otsevists, led by the subsequent renegade Alexinsky. Lenin writes, quote, the representatives of the two extreme tendencies, both of which are subject to bourgeois ideology, and both of which are equally hostile to the party, agree with one another in their contest against the Bolsheviks. The resolution proposed by Trotsky differs in form only from the effusions of Axelrod and Alexinsky. Its terms are exceedingly cautious and aim at expressing a super-fractional justice. But what is its actual import? The, quote, Bolshevist leaders are to blame for everything. This philosophy of history does not differ in any way from that of Axelrod and Alexinsky, unquote. Continuing the quote, it is not difficult to see how the empty, hollow phrases of Trotsky's resolution serve for the defense of the same standpoint as that adopted by Axelrod and Company and Alexinsky and Company. Here lies the great and abysmal difference between the conciliatory pose of Trotsky and Company, in reality the most faithful servants of the liquidators and Otsevists, and forming the more dangerous evil for the party that they are skilled at concealing their true character behind clever and artificial phrases, and behind apparently anti-fractional and pro-party declarations, and between that really party standpoint which stands for the purging of the party from all liquidators and Otsevists, unquote. The irreconcilable struggle for the principles of Bolshevism continued. All the enemies of Bolshevism joined hands and attacked the Bolsheviks, the party, and its central authorities. Lenin, in dealing with the significance of this struggle and Trotsky's part in it, wrote as follows at the end of 1910, quote, Martov's article and Trotsky's resolution are backed up by certain practical actions directed against the party. Martov's article is merely a literary form clothing the campaign undertaken by the Mensheviks for the purpose of causing a schism in our CC. Trotsky's resolution pursues the same Menshevist aims, the destruction of the central authorities of the Bolsheviks so hated by the liquidators, and with this, the destruction of the party as an organization. It is not sufficient merely to expose these anti-party actions on the part of the Mensheviks and Trotsky, they must be combated, unquote. You will see, comrades, that many things have happened in our party, and many of the things which may appear new to our younger comrades are by no means so new to older ones, or to the younger comrades who have studied Lenin's works attentively. There is nothing new under the sun. Lenin continues, quote, "We, therefore, declare on behalf of the whole party that Trotsky is carrying on an anti-party policy, that he is undermining the legality of the party and entering on a path of adventure and schism. Comrade Trotsky preserves silence on this incontestable truth about the anti-party groups because the real aims of his policy cannot stand the truth. These real aims are an anti-party bloc. Such a bloc is being supported and organized by Trotsky. It goes without saying that Trotsky supports this bloc, for the anti-party elements here get everything they require: liberty for their fractions, glorification and concealment of their activity, skillful advocacy defending them before the working class. It is precisely from the standpoint of fundamental principles that we have to regard this bloc as adventurism in the exactest meaning of the word." Comment: if you're not familiar with the term adventurism in the Marxist sense, it refers to particularly when intellectuals, who may not be grounded in close ties with the masses, start recommending actions which are not consistent with the sentiments of the masses and which won't be supported by them. It's, in other words, getting ahead of the masses. Or at least getting ahead of the masses is probably the most typical manifestation of it. Really, it's any action that is disconnected from the masses. So, in other words, it's a pointless adventure which is not really connected with the mass struggle. If you're interested in this topic, we have a couple of other audiobooks from Lenin titled Adventurism and Revolutionary Adventurism. Continuing, Trotsky does not venture to assert that he finds in the Mensheviks, in the Otsevists, real Marxists, real defenders of the established principles of social democracy. But it is just this necessity of continual dodging which is characteristic of the adventurer. The bloc formed by Trotsky with Patrusov and the group around the newspaper Viperiod is just an adventure, judged from the viewpoint of fundamental principles. This assertion is no less important from the standpoint of the tasks of party politics. The experience of a year has shown that in reality it is precisely the Patrusov group, precisely the Viperiod set, who incorporate the influence exercised by the bourgeoisie on the proletariat. Thirdly and finally, Trotsky's policy is an adventure in an organizational sense." Unquote. 1911. The struggle for the party and its ideas continued. Trotsky continued his anti-party policy. Lenin supplemented his characterization. In June 1911, Lenin wrote as follows, quote, "All Bolsheviks must now gather more closely together, strengthen their fraction, determine their party line with greater accuracy and clarity, collect all scattered forces, and take up the fight for the RSDLP, purged of the supporters of bourgeois influence upon the proletariat." Unquote. And he immediately adds, quote, "Such people as Trotsky, with his puffed-up phrases on the RSDLP, with his kowtowing to the liquidators who have nothing whatever in common with the RSDLP, are now the disease of the age. In reality, they are the bearers of capitulation to the liquidators who are anxious to form a labor party on Stolypin's lines." Unquote. After the lapse of a few months, Lenin wrote as follows in a special circular addressed, quote, to all party organizations, groups, and circles, quote, "Let us merely mention one feature, the most characteristic and general one in the utterances of Trotsky's little group. In the question of tactics and of differences of opinion on principles within the party, Trotsky's arsenal can only supply weapons against the left wing of the party. It need not be said that such a policy is grist to the mill of the adherents of the Golos, the Menshevik newspaper, meaning voice, and to all of the other various degrees of opportunists." Unquote. Trotsky continued his policy, and Lenin continued his characterization, quote, "The real liquidators conceal themselves behind their phraseology and make every endeavor to frustrate the work being done by the anti-liquidators, that is, the Bolsheviks. Trotsky and the Trotskyists and opportunists like him are more harmful than all the liquidators, for the convinced liquidators state their views openly, and it is easy for the workers to recognize the errors of these views. But Trotsky and those similar to him deceive the workers, conceal the evil, and make it impossible to expose and remedy it." Comment: I find this to be so true, and the characterization of Trotskyism as the advanced detachment of the bourgeoisie, I think, is accurate, because they will pull citations that are like 95% context appropriate, but then there's that critical 5% that basically, doesn't match and isn't supporting the point that they're trying to make. So it's a really insidious way of misrepresenting Marxism and Lenin and Stalin and all the enemies of Trotskyism, which is none of these things. And the thing is, you really have to be very well read and to have studied this a lot in order to be able to recognize it and to know, hey, that quote is completely out of context, and I know that because I read the thing. If you haven't read the thing, you might not know that. And so beginning Marxists or just more advanced masses who really haven't studied Marxism at all but might be sympathetic to its leadership, they're going to be standing on the sidelines not really being able to tell who's right, the Trotskyist or the Marxist. But I have had so many comments now from people who said they used to be a Trotskyist until they did more reading, and it, helped to untangle the sort of web of deception that the Trotskyists have put out there. It may sound dramatic, but it really is true, and here's Lenin talking about it way back in 1911. So he knew what was up. Continuing, everyone who supports Trotsky's group supports the policy of lies and deception of the workers, the policy concealing liquidatory aims, full liberty of action for Monsieur Patrusov and company in Russia, and the clothing of their actions in, quote, revolutionary phrases for abroad. This is the essential character of Trotsky's policy, unquote. This characterization, the disguise of right actions and left pseudo-revolutionary phrases, was for Lenin the distinguishing feature of Trotskyism, repeating itself from year to year in different and progressive forms. And Lenin was never weary of pointing out this feature to the party as the most important and characteristic, and at the same time the most dangerous feature of Trotskyism. A few months after writing the characterization here quoted, Lenin wrote as follows on Trotsky, quote, "One trifle has been overlooked by this poor hero of phraseology. A social democrat, in our present terminology meaning a communist, is not a revolutionist unless he recognizes the harmfulness of anti-revolutionary pseudo-socialism in a given country at a given time. That is, unless he's able to recognize that liquidatory and Otzovist aims are harmful in Russia, and unless he knows how to combat similar unsocial democratic tendencies." Unquote. A few months after this, in December 1911, Lenin wrote, quote, "Trotsky calls himself an adherent of the party principles, but on the basis of almost total disregard of the Russian Party Central, which was called into existence by the overwhelming majority of the Russian Social Democratic Organization, the revolutionary phrase serves to conceal the tendency of liquidation, to justify it, and thus to confuse the consciousness of the workers. It is Trotsky's special task to veil the aims of the liquidators, and to throw sand into the eyes of the workers. It is not possible to discuss essentials with Trotsky, for he has no views. It is only possible to contend with convinced liquidators and Otzovists. But we do not care to enter into discussion with a man who plays at concealing the errors of either group. We merely expose him as a diplomatist of the meanest description." Unquote. Comment, wow. So that's Lenin on Trotsky. He's basically saying that you can actually have a debate and discussion with somebody who has incorrect liquidationist and Otzovist views, but you can't have an honest discussion with Trotsky because he doesn't stand for anything. He's just out to run cover for these tendencies no matter what you say. This may give flashbacks to some people who have had debates with Trotskyists. Continuing, it is not difficult to prophesy that these party historical documents here quoted will presently be explained away in the most convenient and Philistine manner by references to anger, heat of the moment, accidental collisions, etc. I thus consider it to be my duty, though a disagreeable one, since Comrade Trotsky has now forced the party to occupy itself with the history of the relations between Trotskyism and Bolshevism, to follow Lenin's utterances and the characterization made by Lenin of the relations between the party and Trotskyism, not only for a single year, not only with regard to any single question, but systematically during the whole period of 15 years which have passed since the party became acquainted with Trotskyism. If a definite relation has existed between Trotskyism and our party for a number of years, cropping up systematically at every turning point of party history, and not merely becoming apparent on one single question or on one single occasion, then even the most Philistine and sluggish mentality cannot explain away this circumstance by references to momentary anger, accidental conflicts, and the like. Even the most sluggish mind must recognize that if Lenin continued for 15 years to enlighten the party on Trotskyism, and his characterization proved correct at every turning point of party history, whether the tide of revolution was rising, falling, or rising again, then it's not a case of animosity, of personal opinion, but it's perfectly obvious that Trotskyism represents a trend of policy which reappears systematically, and that the foundation of Bolshevism, as the theory and practice of the proletarian communist revolution, can only be laid down by fighting against this trend of policy. Comrade Trotsky confined himself to defending to the Russian workers the standpoint which I have above characterized in Lenin's words. The position held by the Bolsheviks in the Second International is well known. Even at that time, the Bolsheviks, especially Lenin, were hated by the leaders of the Second International. Even at that time, these leaders felt that Bolshevism, and again especially Lenin, represented some new force destined to supplant them, and therefore the press organs of the Second International opened their pages to every slander against the Bolsheviks and Bolshevism. But during the whole period of Lenin's exile, during the whole period of the revolution and counter-revolution, Lenin was never given even one single opportunity of appealing to the workers from the tribune of the press organs of the Second International and of telling the German, French, or Austrian workers the truth about Bolshevism. In actual fact, we were boycotted by the Second International. But on the other hand, Lenin's opponents, Martov, Don, and Trotsky, were given every opportunity of expressing their views, and these were able to spread abroad any amount of lies and slanders, since they were assured in advance that Lenin would not be permitted to reply. Trotsky availed himself of this opportunity to lay the, quote, philosophy of Bolshevism before the international labor movement in something like the following form. The Leninists were a clique of intellectuals who, under the leadership of Lenin, a man who shrank at nothing, were holding the Russian proletarian movement in their hands in some obscure manner, whilst it was only the ignorance and backwardness of the Russian proletariat which made it trust the Bolsheviks. The most important task was to rescue the proletariat of Russia from the power of this clique and its leader, Lenin. This is the conception of Bolshevism which Comrade Trotsky forced upon the International at that time. This is the manner in which he represented the historical victory of the inter-party struggle in Russia, the import of the struggle between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, to the socialist workers of Europe. With reference to the article sent on this subject to the International by Martov and Trotsky, Lenin wrote the following in the year 1911, quote, "Martov expounds Menshevik views. Trotsky follows in the wake of the Mensheviks, taking cover behind particularly sonorous phrases. Martov sums up the Russian experience by saying, quote, Blankist and anarchist lack of culture triumphed over Marxist culture, unquote, read Bolshevism over Menshevism. Martov again, quote, Russian social democracy spoke too zealously in Russian, in contrast to the, quote, general European methods of tactics. Trotsky's philosophy of history is the same. The sectarian spirit, intellectual individualism, ideological fetishism are placed in the foreground. The, quote, struggle for influence over the politically immature proletariat, that is the core of the matter to him, unquote. After describing the views thus presented to the German workers by Comrade Trotsky, Lenin continues, quote, the theory that the struggle between Bolshevism and Menshevism is a struggle for influence over an immature proletariat is by no means new. We find it in innumerable books, pamphlets, and articles published by the liberal press since the year 1905, if not since 1903. Martov and Trotsky lay liberal views, trimmed with Marxism, before the German comrades. It's an illusion to believe, declares Trotsky, that Bolshevism and Menshevism have struck deep roots in the proletariat. This is a typical example of the sonorous but empty phrases of which our Trotsky is master. It is not in the, quote, depths of the proletariat that the differences lie between Bolshevism and Menshevism, but in the economic conditions of the Russian Revolution. Martov and Trotsky, by ignoring these conditions, have deprived themselves of the possibility of comprehending the historical import of the internal party conflict in Russia. To talk about various trends in the Russian Revolution and to label these sectarianism, a lack of culture, etc., and here Kamenev adds, these are terms employed by Trotsky against the Bolsheviks with the idea of alarming the German Philistines. Continuing Lenin, without according a single word to the most important economic interests of the proletariat, the liberal bourgeoisie, and the democratic peasantry is to sink to the level of the most vulgar journalism, unquote. Comrade Lenin explained the matter to Comrade Trotsky, quote, Martov defends the education of the peasantry, who are carrying on a revolutionary struggle against the aristocracy, by the liberals, who betrayed the peasantry to the aristocracy. This is nothing else than the substitution of liberalism for Marxism. It is nothing more nor less than liberalism disguised in Marxist phrases. The struggle between Menshevism and Bolshevism is indissolubly bound up with this actuality, for it is here the struggle between the support lent to the liberals on the part of the Mensheviks and the overthrow of the hegemony of the liberals over the peasantry by the Bolsheviks. Thus, the attempt to explain away our dissensions by the influence of the intelligentsia, the immaturity of the proletariat, etc., is merely a naive and childish repetition of liberal fairy tales, unquote. We see that Trotsky came to Lenin by means of telling the international proletariat liberal fairy tales on Leninism. Quote, a chasm lies between our standpoint and Martov's standpoint, and this chasm between the views of various, quote, intellectuals merely reflects, despite Trotsky's opinions to the contrary, a chasm which actually existed in the year 1905 between two classes, that is, between the revolutionary fighting proletariat and the treacherous bourgeoisie, unquote. This is what Comrade Trotsky, according to Lenin, did not comprehend about Bolshevism. But if he did not comprehend this, did he comprehend anything about it at all? Quote, Trotsky distorts Bolshevism for he has never been able to form any definite views on the role played by the proletariat in the Russian bourgeois revolution, unquote. Comrade Lenin, after characterizing Trotsky's whole representation of Bolshevism to the uninformed German workers as a, quote, refined breach of faith, closed his characterization with the following words, quote, in 1903, Trotsky was a Menshevist. He left the Mensheviks in 1904, returned to them in 1905, brandishing ultra-revolutionary phrases on the whole, and again turned his back on the Mensheviks in 1906. At the end of 1906, he defended the election alliance with the Cadets, thus actually siding with the Mensheviks again, and in the spring of 1907 he declared at the London Congress that the, quote, difference between him and Rosa Luxemburg was rather a difference of individual shading than of political tendency. Trotsky plagiarizes today from the ideas of one fraction, tomorrow from those of the other, and thus he regards himself as a being superior to both. Theoretically, Trotsky does not agree with the liquidators and Otsevists on any single question, but in actual practice, he is entirely in agreement with the Golos and Viperiod group, Kamenev adds, that is, with the supporters of bourgeois influence over the proletariat. I must declare that Trotsky represents his fraction only and enjoys a certain amount of faith exclusively on the part of the Otsevists and liquidators." Unquote. 1912. The year 1912 was a year of changes. In January, the Bolsheviks broke off the last remains of organizational connections with the Mensheviks and formed their own purely Bolshevist Central Committee at their own Bolshevist conference at Prague. They excluded the liquidators from the party and proclaimed a program of revolutionary action. After the bloodbath on the Lena, a stormy wave of proletarian movement arose for the first time since 1905. This movement appropriated the program and tactics of the Bolsheviks in their entirety. The, quote, Bolshevist epidemic, to use the malicious term coined by the Mensheviks at the time, began to spread and presently gained the final victory. The awakening labor movement removed the liquidators systematically from every position which they had contrived to gain during the previous sorrowful years of counter-revolution. This was the beginning of the revolutionary attack under the slogans of the Bolsheviks, under the leadership of the Bolsheviks, an attack which led to barricade fighting in Leningrad as early as the middle of 1914. What was the attitude adopted by Comrade Trotsky with regard to these decisive events? Did this wave of revolutionary uplift, the strengthening of the labor movement, perhaps induce Comrade Trotsky to abandon the standpoint of an agent of Menshevism, held by him during the preceding years of disintegration and decay? Did his ultra-left theory of permanent revolution, after lying unused for years in his drawer, perhaps aid him to break the bonds fettering him to counter-revolutionary Menshevism? No. Comrade Trotsky remained true to himself and to the Menshevist liquidators. He replied to the organizational development and establishment of the Bolshevik Party by a closer alliance with the Mensheviks in their struggle against Bolshevism. It was due to his endeavors that the so-called August Bloc came into being. This bloc was the alliance and organizational mustering of every non-Bolshevist and anti-Bolshevist group and subgroup. Quote, "This bloc," wrote Lenin, "is composed of lack of principle, hypocrisy, and empty phrases. The basis of this bloc is evident. The liquidators receive full liberty to proceed as before, and Comrade Trotsky covers them by the revolutionary phrase, which costs him nothing and binds him to nothing." Unquote. On the orders of this bloc, Comrade Trotsky spread abroad even more slanders than before against the Bolsheviks, as leaders of the proletarian advance then beginning. Comrade Lenin characterized Trotsky's writings at that time as, quote, "deceiving and misleading the whole working class." With regard to an article written by Trotsky for the German workers, Lenin wrote that it represented, quote, "such a compilation of unconsidered self-praise and sententious lies that there can be no doubt but that the liquidatory commission to write this article was placed in competent hands." Unquote. But perhaps Comrade Trotsky was only in agreement with the enemies of the Bolsheviks as far as the Bolshevist organization was concerned. Perhaps there was still some difference between him and the Mensheviks, the servants of the liberals, in questions referring to the tasks, the aims, and the tactics of the rising proletarian movement, in questions referring to the tasks, aims, and tactics of the new revolution. Let us ask Lenin again. Quote, "Trotsky abused the conference in every key and assured the good people that the struggle for the right of combination was the basis of the events on the Lena and their after-effects. That, quote, this demand stands and will continue to stand as the control point of the revolutionary mobilization of the proletariat," unquote. Scarcely had a week passed away, and these miserable phrases, ground out of the same machine which supplies the liquidators with their phrases, were blown away like dust. "It is only the liberal chatterboxes and the liberal labor politicians," continues Lenin, "who are capable of placing the right of combination in the center of revolutionary mobilization," unquote. Lenin then compares the policy pursued by the liquidators and by Comrade Trotsky with the revolutionary Bolshevik policy of the Petersburg proletariat. Quote, "The proletariat of Petersburg," wrote Lenin, "has grasped that the new revolutionary struggle is not to be carried on for the sake of one single right." Kamenev adds, "the right of combination, but for the liberty of the whole people. The proletariat of Petersburg has grasped that the evil must be attacked at its center, at its source, that the whole system of Tsarist reactionary Russia must be destroyed. The proletariat of Petersburg has grasped that it is a piece of ridiculous stupidity to make this demand for the right of combination. There is no greater lie than the liberal invention, repeated by the liquidators and immediately afterwards by Trotsky, that the, quote, struggle for the right of combination lay at the root of the tragedy on the Lena and of the mighty echoes awakened by this event all over the country," unquote. So commenting, in case you're not familiar with that terminology, the right of combination is the right to unionize. So the Lena massacre was a big massacre at this time of striking gold miners. So basically what the Mensheviks and Trotsky were saying is that the center of the revolutionary struggle is about the right to unionize. But the Bolsheviks, and apparently the proletariat of Petersburg also, said that, this goes much deeper than just that single right. The entire Tsarist system must be destroyed. Continuing, the difference is very obvious between the Bolshevik conception of fundamental tasks and that of the Mensheviks and Comrade Trotsky. But Lenin explains again and again the counter-trend of Comrade Trotsky's conception of these tasks. Trotsky followed Axelrod. He found himself superior to the, quote, uncultured, barbaric, sectarian, Asiatic Bolsheviks, in that he, Trotsky, is a, quote, European, and fights, quote, beneath the tactical flag of European social democracy, unquote. Comment, that sucks. I mean, I didn't like him before, but that's really horrendous. Continuing, but what is the meaning of this confrontation of Europeanness and European tactics with Bolshevism? It means one thing only, renunciation of the fulfillment of the immediate revolutionary tasks in the Russia of the Tsar and the great landowners, and all for the sake of the parliamentary tactics of the European socialists. Quote, this famous Europeanization, writes Lenin, is being talked about by Don and Martov, Trotsky and Levitsky, and by the other liquidators in every possible key. It is one of the main rivets securing their opportunism. Their opportunism lies in the fact that the moment which they choose for imparting a European parliamentary propagandist character to the party is precisely the moment when the party is not faced by European tasks, but by an immediate struggle on the spot. Their idea is thus to avoid the task of revolution. Comment, that's what Europe's been doing ever since, to the detriment of everyone. Continuing, and to substitute revolutionary tactics by parliamentary tactics, unquote. The little word Europeanism on the lips of the liquidators and Trotsky during the period between 1910 and 1914, further supplemented by the little word barbarism of the Bolsheviks, served to conceal the renunciation of the revolutionary tasks and revolutionary tactics of the proletariat of Russia. Let us read what Lenin wrote in reply to such a European article from Comrade Trotsky's pen. Quote, this is the daydream of an opportunist intellectual who, in the midst of the difficult and non-European conditions facing the labor movement in Russia, and note from Kamenev, Lenin wrote this article for the legal Zvezda and therefore employed legal terms, but here we should read, under the conditions imposed by the revolutionary tasks facing the labor movement in Russia, has worked out an excellent European plan, and because he has done this, boasts of his Europeanness to the whole world, unquote. These tactics, actually implying approbation of the transition of the party from the path of revolution to the path of the then peaceful European socialists, were proclaimed at the time when the new wave of revolution following the bloodbath on the Lena demanded an expressly revolutionary leadership. It is possible that someone will submit the question, how is it possible that the theory of permanent revolution did not restrain Comrade Trotsky from such unrevolutionary tactics? How could he, the representative of this ultra-left theory, lend his support to such anti-revolutionary tactics side by side with the Mensheviks during the obviously revolutionary situation from 1912 to 1914, unquote. But anyone putting this question would only prove that they have not yet comprehended Lenin's characterization of Trotskyism, right politics disguised in left phraseology. Comment, that is also how we describe some aspects of fascism. Continuing, examine the standpoint of the liquidators, Lenin continued to explain to the naive in the year 1913. The essential character of their liquidatory standpoint is artificially disguised beneath Trotsky's revolutionary phrases. The naive and entirely inexperienced are still often deceived by this disguise, but the slightest closer examination immediately disperses this self-deception, unquote. 1914. Then came the year 1914. The revolutionary movement and the proletariat made rapid strides forward. The waves of the tempest of revolution rose higher and higher. Trotsky's viewpoint remained unchanged in the question of the principles of revolution and the tactics of the proletarian movement. Let us read what Lenin wrote about him in the year 1914. Quote, "Comrade Trotsky has never yet possessed a definite opinion on any single earnest Marxist question. He has always crept into the breach made by this or that difference and has oscillated from one side to another." Unquote. Another quote, "The liquidators have their own viewpoint, a liberal and not a Marxian one. Everyone familiar with the writings of Don, Martov, Patrusov and company knows this viewpoint. But Trotsky has no viewpoint, never has had one. He has merely transitions and flittings from the liberals to the Marxists and back again. Fragments of words and high-sounding phrases swing here and there. In reality, Trotsky's resounding, confused, and empty phrases, so misleading to the untrained worker, serve solely for the defense of the liquidators. Trotsky accomplishes this by preserving silence on the question of illegality. Kamenev adds, that is, of the revolutionary organization and policy of the working class. By endeavoring to convince us that a liberal labor policy does not exist amongst us at all. Kamenev adds, that is, no endeavor on the part of the Mensheviks to subordinate the labor movement to the cadets, the bourgeois party, etc. Comrade Trotsky addresses a special and lengthy sermon to the 7 deputies, headed by Chikaidze, instructing them as to the cleverest methods of carrying out the policy of rejection of illegality and of the party. Unquote. Then came the tempestuous months of the year 1914. The labor movement advanced from political and economic strikes to armed demonstrations, only interrupted by the mobilization of the army. In July, the workers of Petersburg were already at the barricades. It was necessary to strike a balance. It was necessary to show to the working class the political currents and tendencies emerging from illegality and from the influence of the refugees from abroad in order that they might carry on their movement further. Lenin wrote a comprehensive article and had it published in May 1914 in the Bolshevist periodical Enlightenment. Here he drew the balance of the 10 years of struggle between Bolshevism and Trotskyism, the struggle which we have followed in its various stages. Quote, "The old participators in Russia's Marxist movement know Trotsky's figure very well. There's no need to say anything about him to them, but the younger generation of workers does not know him, for he represents a certain type. At the time of the old Iskra, 1901 to 1903, people of this type oscillated between the so-called economists and the Iskra group, the Spark, Lenin's group. When we speak of the liquidators, we so designate a certain ideological tendency rooted in Menshevism and economism, a tendency closely bound up with the policy and ideology of a certain class, the liberal bourgeoisie. These people explain that they are above the fractions, but the sole basis for this assertion is that they take their ideas from one fraction today and from another tomorrow. Trotsky was an open adherent of the Iskra from 1901 to 1903, and Ryanisov named the role played by Trotsky at the Party Congress in 1903 that of a Lenin's cudgel. By the end of 1903, Trotsky was an open Menshevist. He had deserted from Iskra to the economists. He proclaimed that, quote, "a deep chasm yawned between the old and the new Iskra," unquote. In the years 1904 to 5, he left the Mensheviks and maintained an irresolute attitude. At one time, he cooperated with Martinov, an economist. At another time, he dished up his left permanent revolution again. In 1906 to 7, he approached the Bolsheviks, and in the spring of 1907, he declared himself in full agreement with Rosa Luxemburg. During the epoch of the decline, he turned to the right again after lengthy, quote, anti-factional vacillations, and in August 1912, he joined the bloc of the liquidators. Now he leaves them again, but in all essentials he repeats their ideas. Such types are characteristic of the crumbling away of the historical formations of yesterday, when the mass labor movement in Russia was not fully awakened. The younger generation of workers must learn to recognize this type of person, who, without concerning himself about party decisions or about the experience won in the present labor movement in Russia, simply step forward with the most unheard of claims. Unquote. Lenin deemed it necessary to say this to the younger generation of workers on the eve of a fresh advance of the revolutionary movement in the working class. He here drew the balance of the 10-year struggle carried on by Bolshevism, not only against Menshevism, but also against Trotskyism. It is comprehensible to everyone that when a characterization of this kind is repeated from year to year, and not merely with reference to this or that error, but with reference to the whole course pursued by Comrade Trotsky, it is not done for any superficial reason. Comrade Lenin saw in Trotsky the embodiment of a current, of a political tendency, harmful to Bolshevism. For this reason, and for this reason only, Lenin considered it necessary to warn the party against Trotskyism. And that's the end of section 2, the period of counter-revolution. We're about halfway through the piece, so we're going to leave it there for today, and we will pick this up next week. Thanks to the patrons whose names are on the screen, and if you'd like to get your name on the screen, patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall.